One of my earliest memories is of my father reading to me from Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. It mattered little, or not at all, that I couldn't follow the story. The language was melodic and entrancing, and I loved it, though I'm not sure we ever made it past the introductory verses. This was a cheap but wonderful edition with illustrations interspersed with the text, arrowheads, Indian chiefs. And I found, not too long ago, in a junk shop, a pristine copy of that very edition. Despite the many years of schooling that followed, this was the first and only time I was to be presented with the work of one of this country's great literary figures, an international celebrity in his day, whose books were in every home. In his new biography of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the first in many decades, Charles Calhoun, a current member of this library, has done a heroic job of redeeming this poet, a leading member of the Athenaeum then, from chronic and undeserved obscurity. Aptly subtitled A Rediscovered Life, Mr. Calhoun retraces Longfellow's remarkable achievements. He was the first to bring the study of living languages into the curriculum and the development of his godlike stature, both here and abroad. All the while, similar to what Matthew Pearl has done in the Dante Club, a work of fiction, he presents his subject as the flesh and blood son of New England that he was, husband, father, and cherished friend. It is a fascinating story, and we are grateful that you have told it. Ladies and gentlemen, Charles Calhoun. Before you speak, I just want to state that this talk is being taped by the WGBH Forum Network. We're very grateful for that.
Thank you. So I think that means please behave. You're on camera this morning. I'm delighted that you brave the crowds and the elements today to be here today to hear me talk about the book. I'd also like to remind you that today is Mardi Gras, and given Longfellow's Evangeline and her Cajun connection, I think it's a well-timed event, whatever the distractions outside may be. I've spoken about Longfellow in many venues, but this is a particularly resonant one. He knew this building well. He would recognize it, I think, largely if he came back today. There is a bust right over there on the sideboard of his older friend, Washington Alston, the painter. There is a portrait I can see from where I stand of his younger friend, Annie Fields, a great sergeant portrait in the reading room. The building is full of mementos of Longfellow and his times and his friends. And we're also in a part of Boston, I think, that's full of memories. Only a few steps from here is George Tickner's house at the corner of Park and Beacon. Much altered, but that was the house where the man who got Longfellow his job at Harvard as a professor of languages lived. Helen Hannon pointed out to me the other day that even the Civil War monument on the Common has a picture of Longfellow in the base in one of the bas-reliefs. One of the dignitaries of the day, they chose to include him in that monument. If you walked in the other direction, you'd come to Court Street, where his great friend Charles Sumner practiced law for many years before going off to the Senate. You would see the Parker House, the successor to the original Parker House, where the famous Saturday Club met from the 1850s on. You would see King's Chapel. Longfellow was a very proper Unitarian and was quite often there, various occasions. You would see especially the Old Corner Bookstore, one of the sacred places of American literary history. It's unfortunately empty at the moment, but well preserved and waiting for an appropriate tenant, which I hope it finds very soon. That was the home of Tickner and Fields, the great literary publishing house of 19th century America. So this whole area is filled with these memories of Longfellow and his friends, but particularly 39 Beacon Street. If you've read the book already, you know what an important locale that is in Longfellow's story. It was the house of the Appletons. He fell in love with Frances Appleton in 1836. She kept him waiting for 7 years, but the happy day finally came, and in 1843 they were married in the drawing room of that house, in the boat-fronted house that still stands there. If I had any vignette of young Longfellow I'd like to try to bring back to life today, it's the image of him in his love-struck youth. He was still young at that time, wandering up and down on the common between Beacon Street and the Frog Pond, hoping that Miss Appleton might come out of the house and he could pretend as if by accident he crossed paths. And I think she was not always happy to see him there, but there were these occasions that eventually paid off. So at any rate, this is Longfellow country. We're surrounded by these wonderful memories and associations of his life in 19th century Boston and Cambridge. But I'm always struck not only by these secondhand books that pop up very easily on eBay or in secondhand stores, how much of Longfellow still survives in our culture. I spend a lot of time these days commuting by bus between South Station and Portland, Maine, where I work part of the week. And you get these free movies on the bus, as you may know. You get the same free movie, unfortunately, over and over again for days at a stretch. But this week's movie was Spider-Man 2, which isn't bad, I have to say. But I was just overwhelmed, really knocked down to discover that in the course of this movie, there's a scene when the young man who's the hero of it, Peter Parker, I think his name is, he's trying to court this young lady, and someone says, well, you should read poetry to her. This will work the charm. And so he's in a laundromat, and somehow he picks up a book he finds there, and what should it be but the Song of Hiawatha? And he does read, I think I have the passage here. Yes, he does read a few lines from one of the cantos of Hiawatha. Day by day he gazed upon her. Day by day he sighed with passion. Day by day his heart within him grew more hot with love and longing for the maid with yellow tresses. Now, what he didn't know is Longfellow meant that very ironically. The yellow tresses are a dandelion. The person being spoken about is an evil wind. But in the movie, it worked. It helped young Peter Parker, when he wasn't wearing his Spider-Man costume and leaping from tall buildings, to win at least the attention of this young lady. So Longfellow lives in these strange ways, and you may have fond of stories of your own of that nature. I was also struck by the December issue of Portland Magazine, a local publication in Maine. They did a big feature on the book. Longfellow is Portland's native son and certainly most famous resident ever. And as a teaser on the cover of the magazine, they had the lines, Longfellow, sexy again. Now, I ask you, Longfellow, sexy again. Those are three words I never thought in my life to see juxtaposed in any fashion. I feel if I've accomplished nothing else in my career to have, at least in terms of Portland Magazine, to have made that connection. I don't know if it sells books, but I hope at least it helps keep Longfellow's name in circulation in the culture. And that's what I'm really trying to do in presenting this book and in talking about it. I am not trying to make the case that he is the greatest 19th century American poet. I mean, obviously Whitman and Dickinson had that sewn up, and they're in a category all their own. But he is a very good poet and an unfairly neglected one. And I'm working very hard to try to get him back into the schools. The universities will be a harder nut to crack, but there are some signs that the hostility towards Longfellow, even in academic circles, is lessening. But he does have a very interesting life story, and he has so many resonances throughout culture, not only in New England, but for all of the United States. And this way he helps create an American identity through characters like Miles Standish, Priscilla Alden, Evangeline Hiawatha, as he pronounced it, and so many others. I think even today with this event happening outside here, the fact that we speak of New England patriots owes something to Longfellow's influence, because he's the one who popularizes and who kind of simplifies and embellishes the Paul Revere story, and so many other pieces of colonial revivalism. And this association of New England with the colonial past, with the revolution, with patriotism, I think Longfellow deserves at least a modicum of credit for the extravaganza that may burst upon us any moment now. Well, what I wanted to do, there's so many ways of approaching him. What I wanted to do today was to do something very visual that would give you some sense, I think, of his cultural power even into our own time. And so I want to start with, if we could have the lights, please. I want to start with the image that's on the cover of the biography that Beacon Press published last summer. It's part Errol Flynn, part Johnny Depp. If he spent maybe a month at the gym and had a sort of an open-neck shirt and a black stallion and a recumbent blonde, and it could work as a romance novel cover, perhaps. But I think obviously what we were trying to do in choosing this image, which is an 1840 portrait that you can see in the Craigie House in Cambridge by Cephas Giovanni Thompson, it's to get away from this more familiar image that we all have of the gray-bearded elderly Longfellow, the face that you see on so many cigar boxes, pieces of furniture, pieces of porcelain, postcards, all this memorabilia and commercial spin-off from his own image and also the images of his family and many of his characters. So in using an image like this, we were trying to get people to rethink the man and to see him not only as a young man with all the passions and the distractions and the difficulties that a young man might face trying to make his way in the world as a writer, but to kind of reconceptualize him in the public imagination. Now, the image that's surely much more familiar is this view of Longfellow. This is a photo that was taken in Portland, Maine, a year before he died in 1881 at the Lamson Studio, and it shows what he looked like in, say, the last 2 decades of his life, and that, of course, is the image that has stuck in so many reproductions. He's a man, 74, definitely showing the ravages of time and this series of great tragedies that afflicted his life, particularly the deaths of both of his wives and the great periods of grief that followed those. But when, in trying to express to you not only what Longfellow looked like, but what people thought he ought to look like and what people thought an American poet ought to look like, I want to jump around a bit in time and place and to leave this elderly gentleman you see here and go to a very different writer indeed, Virginia Woolf. Now, Virginia Woolf would seem to stand for everything, would seem to stand against everything that Longfellow stood for. She's a modernist, she's anti-Victorian, she's poking fun continually at her Victorian parents and grandparents' generation. She is someone who regarded the Victorian writers as repressed, as inauthentic, as people to be dismissed to the secondhand bookstores. Yet in 1935, in Vanessa Bell's studio in London, Virginia Woolf and a group of her Bloomsbury friends produced a small play called Freshwater. She'd written it about 10 or 12 years earlier. It is the story of her great-aunt and her circle on the Isle of Wight. And the great-aunt was named Julia Margaret Cameron, now a fairly well-known name, at least in the history of photography. In her day, she was regarded as something of an eccentric. She was a woman of some means who had kind of latched on to Tennyson. Tennyson lived in a house called Farringford, which you can still see. It's actually a golf resort now on the Isle of Wight. And she lived in a smaller house nearby, Dimbleau. It's now a small museum. And she was a very avid photographer, apparently to her friends, an amateur one, although she made some money from it. And it turns out that she was so good at it, and she's photographed so many interesting and important people of her day, that now she's regarded, along with Nadar in France and probably Matthew Brady in this country, as one of the 3 great portraitists in the history of photography in the 19th century. Now, her method was to find out who was visiting, Tennyson up the road, and she would go call and grab them and, sweep them off the mile or so away to her house, and she would take them out into a kind of glassed-in hen yard, which I think the turkey you see, that's Julia Margaret Cameron with her head in the photograph up there, and the turkey above is a reference to the hen yard. She had set up a photographic studio there, and she would drape her subject with some theatrical-looking garb and take a number of exposures, and she was very successful in selling some of these images afterwards. So there's a whole gallery of high Victorian worthies, writers, scientists, artists, and also less well-known people whom she dressed up in Arthurian and other romantic costumes. And in the case of Longfellow, he was a good sport and went along with this. Not quite sure what he thought of the whole experience, but that, of course, this famous image resulted. Now, this is Longfellow at his most bardic. He looks as if he has just stumbled in off the moors with the wind in his hair and the sea spray in his beard. That may actually have been the case because the Tennyson Cameron houses are right on the downs in the southern part of the Isle of Wight. A very dramatic landscape, lots of heavy wind off the sea. So I could imagine him walking into her hen yard for this photographic experience with his hair blown in this fashion and a kind of grim, determined look. Well, I'm going to get this over with and get back to a warmer spot for tea or whatever. But she's made such a striking image of him as a figure of great power, in this case of literary power and of cultural authority. His hand is not just a hand, it almost looks like a claw. His body is lost in this theatrical robe of whatever kind that she pulled out of her closet. It's an image of what a high Victorian great portraitist thought a major poet of the day should look like, even if it really wasn't a particularly realistic image of what Longfellow in those days, that this was 1868, might have seemed to us. But it's a wonderful photograph, and it appears in many venues. It's on the cover of the Library of America edition of Longfellow's poetry, also the Penguin edition. And when you put it into the oeuvre of her work, it's really a tribute, I think, not only to her skill as a photographer, as someone who realized the artistic, the aesthetic possibilities of photography, but as a tribute to Longfellow's own reputation outside his own country. I would argue that in the 1860s, he was the most famous poet in the English-speaking world. Tennyson would have been the rival, but because Longfellow's editions of his poems were pirated by British publishers and sold very cheaply, I think he reached a much broader, particularly a broader working-class audience, even than Tennyson. So I make that claim for him on that basis. And, of course, he was translated into all European languages and some non-European ones. And he represented for the rest of the world, in some ways, the best that American culture of the day could offer. And he enjoyed great celebrity on that account. Well, getting back to this idea of not so much what a poet really looks like, but what a poet should look like in the popular view, it seems to me that Americans of Longfellow's time had several models to choose from. And this is one of them, Lord Byron. Lord Byron and his page boy. I think Byron is about to leave for his first trip to Greece. He is a dashing, romantic figure. He's aristocratic, well-connected, moneyed to some degree. He is also a figure of great controversy. He's someone who's offended a lot of people. His poetry is considered quite wild by the respectable. He's a person who's sexually ambiguous in his own life. He's someone who's defying all kinds of conventions, yet he is protected by his aristocratic status and his standing. He's kind of world historical figure as a great celebrity. So this notion that the poet could be a Byronic figure is a very powerful one. Sully did a portrait of Byron that circulated widely in 19th century America, so a lot of Americans were familiar with this model. There was even a friend of Longfellow's here in Boston, Samuel Gridley Howe, who was quite Byronic. He had fought in the Greek Wars of Independence. He was a dashing figure. He's one of the people who took great chances in financing John Brown's raid, which got him into a lot of trouble. He's perhaps better remembered today now for his work at Perkins School for the Blind and for having, with Laura Bridgman, for having married Julia Ward of Battle Hymn of the Republic fame. But in his day, he was one of these dashing Byronic types, and he was very close to Longfellow and Sumner in this circle of young men in Cambridge and Boston. But Longfellow himself did not obviously fall into this mold. So what are some other possible models for a poet? Well, there's this one, Walt Whitman. This is the title, from the title page of his first edition in 1855 of Leaves of Grass. And this was really a slap in the face of literary respectability. In 1855, you didn't present yourself in public looking like that if you wanted to be taken seriously as a literary figure. He's not wearing a coat. He has an open-necked shirt. You can see his undershirt beneath it. He's standing in this kind of slouchy, defiant, in-your-face pose. I think today we would say this is a man with attitude. And that was certainly in 1855. That was his approach. In later editions of Leaves of Grass, this image is eliminated. But it symbolizes, or for our purposes today, it stands for a different way of seeing the poet. Not Byronic and aristocratic and perhaps a renegade in some senses, but a man who is a rebel in another sense, but from a kind of working class, plebeian milieu. He's someone you could have seen on the Manhattan waterfront or crossing Brooklyn Ferry, perhaps dressed very much like that and with that smirk on his face. But someone of Longfellow's genealogy and of his background, of his aspirations, of his position as a Harvard professor, certainly, and as someone aspiring to the hand of Miss Appleton in marriage, the Appletons being one of the great textile mill fortunes of New England. Longfellow was not going to present himself in a Whitman-esque fashion in any sense, although later in the 19th century, other American poets began to do so. Well, there's a third model, and my final one to present to you, and that is the poet as someone who is deranged, the poet maudit. In America, the great example certainly being Poe. Poe is someone who hated Longfellow, by the way. If you've read the book, there's a section on the Longfellow War that he launches. Longfellow stood for everything Poe loathed, including New England respectability. But, Poe is a man of genius, perhaps more as a writer of prose than of poetry, but still a major literary figure, but a man with many, many problems of psychological nature and is exacerbated by his drinking, by his inability to hold jobs very long, his penchant for offending everyone. Yet it's a model of the poet as someone who is almost demonically inspired and who can achieve, who may have a horrible life and be miserable, yet who can achieve remarkable things in his poetry. And this is a model, goes back to Chatterton, perhaps, in an earlier generation, and it's picked up by Rimbaud in France later in the 19th century. And in the 20th century in America by any number of poets, you think of Hart Crane, perhaps, Sylvia Plath, even, in a different style and mood. But again, a model of poetry that someone like Longfellow did not adhere to, either in his personality or in his biographical circumstances. So if you're not falling into one of these three categories, and you want to be a professional poet in this country, say in 1840, 1850, what do you do? By chance, Longfellow was a Harvard professor of languages. He starts this long process of poet professors. Almost all poets, successful poets now, are professors, one degree or another, but he was the first. So he is presenting himself. He never articulated this. I'm pulling it together from various pieces of his biography. But he presented himself as someone who was certainly very learned. Poetry was not a Whitman-esque experience of trying to replicate the language of the ordinary man of the streets, but it was a very well-educated, well-formed, almost in a Germanic sense of Bildung, a profession that you studied to always improve yourself at. It was also a very respectable calling. He proved you could make money at it. He was a very shrewd New England businessman in his dealings with publishers and in his sense of how to market himself to the public. It was a very reassuring role as poet that he assumed. As Emerson said, he's someone you felt you could trust. You weren't going to be surprised too drastically by, as you may have been by Byron or Poe or Whitman. He is the poet whose work you could leave on your parlor table as a symbol not only of your own learnedness and your interest in the arts, but as a token of your drive to improve yourself, and not only yourself, but your family, your domestic circle, and beyond that, the country itself. In 1840s, America was looking for such a poet. This was a country Europeans regarded as full of tobacco-chewing, spitting, bowie knife-wielding ruffians, buffoons. Americans, particularly here in New England, wanted to prove to Europeans that there was a strange love-hate relationship across the Atlantic, but they wanted to prove to Europeans that we too could be civilized, we could produce a respectable poet. So Longfellow, it's part of the story of his success. I mean, it's not all of it, but it's an important element of it, of his falling into this role that people assigned him as the, we didn't have a poet laureate at that time, but had we had one, he certainly would have been it. But in looking at representations of Longfellow, the story is more complicated. And I want to run through a number of them very quickly this afternoon. This is what Longfellow thought he himself looked like. This is a sketch he did in 1829. In his first trip to Europe, he was in the German university town of Göttingen, visiting his friend Edward Preble, also from Portland. And they had definitely gone native. I mean, they were wearing the kind of semi-military, semi-academic garb of the German university student of that day. It was a time when the Burschenschaften, the fraternities were very important. The whole ritual of dueling, of pipe smoking, of sitting around in these costumes, drinking beer. It was very much part of student life, and it was very new to them. And I think he liked presenting himself. This is a sketch he did in a letter that was sent to his family back home. He liked taking this role as a young man off in his travels. But when he came back to the United States, he had picked up a lot of European mannerisms, and he had a wardrobe of European clothing. And he quickly developed a reputation, both in Brunswick, where he was first teaching at Bowdoin, and then in Cambridge, when he got his Harvard job, as being a very dapper, well-turned-out, almost dandyish man. And there's maybe an element of the Byronic in this, too, a kind of watered-down, sartorial Byronism. But the notion of the poet as a well-dressed, urbane, almost aristocratic figure on the local landscape. It wasn't his first silhouette. The Bowdoin College students had all had their silhouettes cut as a kind of early version of the yearbook. But this is the first one that, a good one, I think, that was done of Longfellow. It's as late as 1841. But it not only captures his profile and the very large nose that comes through in many of his images, but his attempt to be dapper and to present himself in this fashion to his new friends in Greater Boston. Now, this attempt to romanticize one's look is very much in evidence in a series of images that Longfellow commissioned the young Maine artist Eastman Johnson to do in 1846 of his immediate circle of friends and of his family. And most of these images are in the Craigie House today. Longfellow at the top, looking very suave, and still, I think, you can see how the figure in the silhouette is easily translated 5 years later into this well-dressed gentleman. His friend Nathaniel Hawthorne on the lower left. Hawthorne's beginning to lose his hair, but as a youth, he was a strikingly handsome man, and you still see that, I think, in Eastman Johnson's view. This is Emerson, not a particularly close friend of Longfellow, but someone he saw quite a bit of in those years, and his very close friend, Charles Sumner. Now, in real life, Sumner in his 20s, when this was done, was a tall, gangly, rather awkward youth trying to find his way through the world. But Eastman Johnson turns him into this rather dreamy-looking, somewhat, if a lawyer can be a romantic, this is a romantic lawyer. And we'll see him again later. So Longfellow, not only in images he's commissioning of himself, or producing of himself, but in producing images he's producing of his circle, he is playing with these ideas of the romantic image. Now, I think we have a much more realistic view of what he looked like in this 1846 daguerreotype of the Longfellow family, the two sons, and Fanny and Henry. This was done by Southworth and Hawes here in Boston. You had to sit very still for these daguerreotype exposures, obviously. The hair on Longfellow's head is not quite as romantically curly as in the earlier images. Fanny is, someone should have told her to smile a little bit. But what's fascinating about this image, and I don't know if you can see it so well here, but if you look at the original, you see that she is holding, this is Charlie and this is Ernie. Charlie is what today we might call probably a hyperactive child, and he's obviously squiggling, and she has her hand on the back of his neck. That grip. And little Ernie is much more docile and sitting there. But it's the family circle, the daughters are not yet born. But again, a very properly turned out gentleman who is married into this family of great wealth and status on Beacon Hill, yet at this point was still a professor of languages at Harvard. Moving on, there were other ways that the Longfellow physiognomy was presented. To go back to those silhouettes for a moment, the idea of the silhouette was not only to present your profile for the sake of your friends so they remember you, but it was also because people were very interested in associating features of physiognomy with character, particularly moral character. So you could look at a certain profile and say, well, that's a good person, or an artistic person, or a hardworking person, or that's a criminal. And this got watered down in the 1840s and 50s among the school of phrenologists who made a lot of money in this country, reading people's skulls. The idea, I'm sure you're familiar with phrenology, it's the notion that there are certain parts of the brain that are responsible for certain sentiments, certain moral faculties, certain personality traits, to use a more modern term, and that if any of these are particularly overdeveloped in you or underdeveloped, there's some element of your skull that will be larger or smaller as a result. And so if you wanted to figure someone out very quickly, you would take a good close look at their head and to see where the bumps were. And phrenologists made a lot of money, feeling people's heads, and a bit like palm readers today, perhaps. But it was a pseudoscience, yet it was an attempt to produce some plausible explanation of human behavior. And it may not be any more outlandish than some of the therapeutic methods we indulge in today. But at any rate, in 1859, in Fowler's Phrenological Almanac, Professor Longfellow and Alfred Tennyson both play a very large role. What I have here is part of the Longfellow section. I don't know where Fowler found this particular image, this rather crude woodcut, but Longfellow, as his fame grew in the 1850s, his picture was appearing more and more frequently. And of course, this is a period when the age of newspapers and magazines was really burgeoning, and print and newsprint was becoming cheaper. There were easier ways of distributing it by train and steamboat, what have you. And so there was this flood of publications in the market, and people like Longfellow being part of it. I don't know how much of this you can read, but it's a little biographical sketch to start with. And then in the second paragraph, he says, his phrenology shows a large brain, a mental temperament, great length of head from the ear forward, which is an indication of intellectual strength, readiness of perception, and memory, and so forth and so on. So when you go home today, you may want to check out your mental faculties, and there are all these phrenological almanacs and charts and models that you can still find in antique shops. So this would, aside from the kind of the freakish interest of this particular pseudoscience, I think, again, it's a wonderful affirmation that Longfellow is someone who matters to the public. I mean, a generation earlier, it might not have occurred to an American publisher to put out a magazine with a poet's head in it. What I think happens that really cements this image of Longfellow as he grows older are images like this. This is 1863. It's the great photographer Alexander Gardner's joint portrait of Sumner and Longfellow. Sumner is in the Senate. He has survived the famous attack on him in 1856 by the deranged Southerner. He has become a martyr of sorts to the Union cause. He's the outspoken abolitionist. And by 1863, he is perhaps the second most powerful man in federal Washington after Lincoln. Longfellow has come to town in search of his son, Charlie, the little boy who's on the earlier view. Charlie had run away from, Longfellow's second wife had died by that point, and Charlie, as a teenager, had run away from home and joined the Army. He was wounded very badly in a battle in Northern Virginia, and his father and brother came to Washington in this kind of Whitman-esque atmosphere of the Army hospitals and the trains coming in loaded with the wounded and dying, trying to find Lieutenant Charlie Appleton Longfellow. And in the course of this sojourn in Washington, he, of course, calls on Sumner, and Gardner persuades him to sit for this, I think, wonderful portrait. And it's interesting. Here's the second most powerful man in Washington and the most famous writer, one might argue, in the country. Harriet Beecher Stowe would have been maybe the runner-up for that title at this point. But certainly the most famous American poet. Here they are, friends, talking to each other. It's part of a 40-year friendship. I can't think of too many other instances in American history where that kind of political, literary link has taken place. But it was very strong and very important to both of these men. And it was important to Gardner, too, because this isn't just a photograph of two celebrities. It's an image, an icon of the politics and poetry of New England. It's an image that has a moral message that it's sending out in the middle of this terrible Civil War. So again, Longfellow is lending himself to this forging of an American national identity and this forging of an image of a poet, in this case, an aging poet with the beard, as we've seen earlier. An image from the 1870s of Longfellow in his study. The Craigie House itself becomes a very important iconic figure in American imagination. Plans of it are sold, copies of it are built in other cities. You can still see one in Milwaukee today, in Hiawatha Park, I believe it's called, near Minnehaha Falls. But this is the interior of his study. The room looks very much the same today if you visit it. It's where he was sitting in that chair probably and dozing on a warm July afternoon after lunch when Fanny in the next room catches her dress on fire and she rushes in and he tries to save her in vain. It's also the room where the Dante Club meets. Stephen referred to Matthew Pearl's very successful book. This is the relatively small room where that group of Dante scholars went over the translation of the Divine Comedy. Then they repaired to the dining room and had their burgundy and canvasback duck and oysters and champagne and whatever. But it's a wonderful view of the interior of a poet's life. And I think it very much influenced this notion of the poet as a scholar. Perhaps the poet is a rather sedate individual compared to Whitman and others, but one that really caught the public's imagination in a big way. And this was much reproduced in other formats. And it has one other cultural message. This is not only Longfellow's home. As many people of the day knew, it was the house that George Washington had lived in during the siege of Boston. And this is the very room that General Washington, who's a Udon statue you can see right over there, that's the room he used as his study, his office, in planning the siege of Boston. And as I think David McCullough argues in a new book that he's bringing out of this period of Washington's life, it's the moment when this Virginian comes to New England and proves that New England militiamen will accept his authority as commander-in-chief, and the American Revolution becomes an American victory in the Revolution becomes possible as a result of this coming together of the various colonies. So this room is a sacred space in the history of the American literary and political imagination, and images of it circulate widely. I want to close with a couple of images from this last trip when Julia Margaret Cameron did the famous portrait that you saw earlier. This is a different version of, and probably a much more realistic version. This is Hawthorne and his daughter Edith in Rome in 1869. They did this grand tour that lasted more than 2 years, and Rome was one place they wintered over. They are photographed by the artist G.P.A. Healy in his studio, and you can see the grid marks that Healy has made on this photographic image. What he did with it was to produce this image, kind of photorealism before its time. One of these characters over here, I think this one is Healy himself. Frederick Church is one of the others, I forget the third. But here's Longfellow and Edith strolling through the Arch of Titus. Now, again, this is an image with enormous cultural reverberation. These are not Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad or, buffoonish Americans wondering why the locals don't speak American. This is a man of the world, a scholarly man, a man of great stature internationally, a widely read and much beloved poet, walking with his daughter. The young lady is not Daisy Miller, despite the Colosseum in the background. She is the new American, the young American who can come to Europe, can absorb what she wants to take from it, but who's not awed by it, who is not destroyed, corrupted by it. This is a very solid, respectable New England couple visiting the old world, sampling its treasures, and going back home afterwards to admire perhaps this image, this triumphal. I mean, what could be more triumphal than passing through this arch among the ruins of the Roman Empire? And a message, too, that America is a new empire of its own. The Roman time has come and gone. The Spanish Empire and the New World has come and gone. New Englanders were fascinated by this notion of the cycles of history, and the American cycle was begun. I think that's part of what this picture is saying. And finally, I want to end with an image, not of Longfellow, but of his three daughters. Very famous characters in their own right. You remember the line from the Children's Hour, "Grave Alice and laughing Allegra and Edith with golden hair." This is an image that Thomas Buchanan Reed did in the 1850s. It's in the dining room at Craigie House, of the three girls. Again, very, very romanticized, but very much in the mode of how Victorians wanted to envision children. Innocent, sweet, a little sappy maybe to our taste, but somehow an image of domestic tranquility, domestic comfort, security, everything that Victorians wanted to associate with the notion of the home. Now, a copy of this image can be found today at the Maine Historical Society in Portland, the organization that owns Longfellow's childhood home and operates it as a museum. It's in a little locket, a kind of photo locket that can be closed, and no one knows where it originated or who it actually belonged to, but it was found on the battlefield at Gettysburg a couple of days after the battle. No one knows, was it dropped by someone in the confusion of the event? Did it fall out of the pocket of a dead or wounded soldier? Was it owned by a northern or a southern soldier? You can concoct any number of stories as how it might have ended up there on the battlefield, but someone found it and it ended up at Maine Historical. What I think it says is, well, actually one friend of mine said, well, maybe it's that, when you buy a new wallet, you get those pictures sometimes that already come in, or maybe that's what you got when you bought a photo album in those days. But I don't think so. I think it meant something to whomever it belonged to. Perhaps it sustained some young soldier boy through the horrors of the military campaigns and the mayhem of Gettysburg. Perhaps he didn't have an image of his own family or his own children. Perhaps this was a substitute that worked very well, a surrogate family, a symbol of a poet who was also a father, an American who was also a great poet, a great man of letters, and someone who had this ability to touch people in every walk of life, in every level of society, and to do so in an image. I think when you hear the story, it still has some emotional power to think that it was the Longfellow's children who somehow provided this notion of safety and security, and this is the home, the family, what these young men were fighting for. So I want to end back with the romanticized, semi-Byronic Cephas Giovanni Thompson image, just to remind you that Longfellow, just as his reputation has risen and fallen, and I hope will gradually rise again, that his image has gone through many permutations in the public eye. And I think it's a tribute to his cultural power that there are so many of these images. I could have shown dozens more, but I hope this gives you at least a sample of how people saw him. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your being here today. This is beyond the call of duty on your part. I'm very grateful.
We do have time for one or two questions, and Charles, if you could perhaps repeat the questions. Absolutely. Because we're still being taped by WGBH Forum Network. Immediately following, Charles Calhoun will be in the Bow Room inscribing copies of Longfellow, A Rediscovered Life.
Thank you. Yes, in the far back, please. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Right. Yeah. That's a very good question. The question had to do with a poem that he published in a Portland newspaper at age 13, and that some people thought he had copied a little too closely from a poem by Thomas Upham. I don't think that really was the case. He may have been imitating Upham in a way. But it's a poem about an incident in Maine's colonial history when there was a massacre of white settlers by a group of Abenaki Indians, and at a place called Lovell's Pond, which is near Freiburg in the western hills of Maine. And it's one of those sites that had lingered in popular imagination. And I think as a child, he certainly heard these stories told. He had a grandfather who lived out in Hiram, Maine, which isn't too far from there. And I think it was part of this, well, two things. One, that people of his generation were beginning to be fascinated by the story of the Indians. I mean, the danger from them was gone, at least in New England, and they could be looked at as a people of legend and of folklore, and this comes through very strongly in Hiawatha. But also, they were beginning to celebrate their Revolutionary era and earlier ancestors, as this New England phenomenon of memorializing the past. So this particular incident came together in the Indian story, which is lively and bloody and brutal, and the story of the ancestors and the struggles they had to overcome to establish America, North America. So I think maybe in his young mind that was part of the lure. Portland itself, Enduring Oaks, where he played as a boy, had a history of these Indian attacks and occasional massacres. So it was something, this had all happened 150 years earlier, but it was something that was in the folkloric atmosphere and would have captured his attention perhaps as an impressionable young man trying to prove himself as a poet. Does that help? Mm-hmm. I think that's ambiguous. I don't think he would have gone quite that far at that stage of his career. I think, he was not a particularly militaristic person. I mean, he supported the American Civil War, certainly, but he had a history of joining the peace societies and of being, particularly in poems like The Arsenal of Springfield, being very critical of the military. So from an early age, I think he picks up from his mother this notion that there's something to be said for being pacific and conciliatory and not being aggressive. So it's such an early work, I would be reluctant to read too much into it. Maybe that's the way of trying to resolve this question. But there are these elements of all those things at work, which is what I think makes it an interesting poem as much as a piece of juvenilia that it really is. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Which languages did he teach besides English?
He never actually taught English as such. He taught the modern Romance languages, most importantly French, Spanish, German, Italian, and then he knew some Portuguese and some of the Scandinavian languages. He knew Dutch, knew a little Anglo-Saxon. He obviously knew some Latin and Greek, as everyone did at that time who was educated. But it's really as a teacher of these modern languages that he's revolutionary, because there was a lot of resistance to bringing them into the classical curriculum. The old boys thought, Latin and Greek and some math and some theology is basically all you needed. To study these new languages opened the possibility of reading some of this rather revolutionary German philosophy or French romantic literature or whatever. But he obviously had an enormous knack for picking up languages quickly and photographic memory and an understanding of the structure of grammar. And this was a very important part of his life beyond his writing of his own poetry, all the translating and popularizing of Molière, Cervantes, Goethe, certainly Dante in the biggest possible way. Yes, ma'am. He was educated at the Portland Academy, then he went off to Bowdoin College, which had not too recently been established in Brunswick, Maine, about a day's ride from Portland. And he got his undergraduate degree there, and then he was sent abroad with money from his father to prepare himself to become a professor of languages at Bowdoin. So a lot of his education is self-education, because he on these long trips through Europe, he's not only learning the languages, he's absorbing the culture and the literary life of all the places he visits. Yes, please.
Hiawatha is a very well-known poem
Mm-hmm.
in name. But I myself can only remember the first 5 lines or something. And my husband recently presented me with a copy from the Longfellow House.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember any of the rest of the poem. Do most people know?
I think there was a generation of school children who probably knew most of it, but that is they are long gone probably. People remember the snippets. It's a very interesting poem. It's a hard poem to read in one sitting. Certainly, you have to take it in small pieces, I think. But it survives as a children's book basically, because there's some beautifully illustrated children's editions. There have been 1 or 2 movie versions of it, but it really has slipped out of the popular culture in a big way, and I'm not sure how much it can be brought back. The problem with it is the image of the Native American it presents is so out of sync with the way that more fairly we view Native American culture now. So there are political problems to it, I think, in using it in schools. But it is a fascinating work on so many levels. I wish that more people did have some exposure to it. Yes.
If you wish Longfellow to recover his literary standing, what poems upon which, or is there a segment of his work that's been largely ignored?
Most of his work is largely ignored. I mean, a few of the short poems survive in anthologies. What he was really good at is writing these long narrative poems that you find in Tales of Wayside Inn, but people find them hard to read now. I would argue that his masterpiece is Evangeline. It is a very Victorian, sentimental poem, but if you can overcome that first hurdle, you can, I think, get a lot of pleasure out of it. And it's a poem that has enormous, I can't stress strongly enough, the cultural power of that one piece of work, in that it takes the story of the Acadians, it puts them back on the map. It is the foundational document for Acadian ethnic identity in Nova Scotia, in New Brunswick, in the St. John Valley of northern Maine, and in Louisiana, in southern Louisiana, with the Cajuns. It's a poem that makes things happen, at least in that context. And on that basis alone, it is a work that deserves respect and reading. So I would argue Evangeline. I would argue that some of the sonnets are well worth reading. He was probably the most accomplished writer of the sonnet in 19th century America. And there are wonderful short poems, or shortish poems, The Jewish Cemetery at Newport, The Fire of Driftwood, My Lost Youth, even Morituri Salutamus, his Bowdoin reunion poem. These, I think they're not poems perhaps you can discuss in a seminar the way you can try to, crack the mystery of a few lines of Emily Dickinson's. But there are poems anyone can enjoy who has a feeling for language and for American history and for the American 19th century. We love Victorian architecture, we love Victorian furnishings, we like Victorian novelists like Charles Dickens, but I think we still have this reluctance to take Victorian American poetry as seriously as we maybe ought to. Well, thank you all very, very much again.